Hey y'all, howdy. Welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandy Broadwell, and today we're going to talk about my best reads of 2024. I have a top 10 list for you guys. I tried to rank them. The ranking, frankly, might change if you ask me on a different day, but this is my list. I read 86 books total, and this is my top 10. I also have two honorable mentions, so we'll just start there. My first honorable mention is going to be The Wall of Storms by Ken Liu. I read The Dandelion Dynasty this year, and it was so unique and cool, and I just couldn't not have a Dandelion Dynasty book on my favorites list, even though it didn't actually make the favorites list. I didn't quite connect with the characters the way that I hoped that I would in this series, but the world and the engineering and the epic scale of it and the dynamics between the characters, it was just all so fascinating, and I flew through all four of these massive books in less than a month. So that has to mean something. The Wall of Storms is the second book of the four, and to me it was the one that just drew me in the most, had the best pacing, and was just such a rewarding read. If you're unfamiliar with the Dandelion Dynasty, this is a series in a Asian-inspired fantasy world. It is about the power struggle of this empire to control itself and the people who are vying for that power. It focuses specifically on a character named Kunigaru and his family and what happens to them through the course of these many years of campaign. It's so hard to describe, but the magic system in The Wall of Storms, or the part of a fantasy story that would normally be taken up by a magic system, is taken up instead by engineering and invention and just the amazing things that Ken Liu was able to write into these stories as if they were things that could be made. It was absolutely mind-bending, and I highly recommend this series. My second and only other honorable mention is going to be The Wisdom of Crowds by Joe Abercrombie, and frankly, it was very hard not to put this in the top 10, but I didn't want to have any repeating authors in the top 10, so if I read a series, I tried to only choose one book from that series, just so that my entire top 10 list wouldn't be like 5 books from the same author. But I do have another Joe Abercrombie book on the top 10, so that's why this one's getting an honorable mention, because I couldn't not. The Wisdom of Crowds is the third and final book of the Age of Madness trilogy. It is the 9th and final book of the First Law world. I just absolutely fell in love with the characters in this book. King Orso, who is the son of King Jezal, Savine Danglotka, who is the daughter of Sandan Glotka, and Ricky, Black Ricky, the daughter of the Dogman. These characters were so compelling. I loved them so much, especially Orso and Ricky. And the trial that took place in The Wisdom of Crowds had me on the edge of my seat. The battle that Ricky was leading in the North for the future of the North, so good. So many twists in that I was just like, Joe Abercrombie is a genius. I love that book. I love that series. It's fantastic. Hi, it's Editing Sandy. I was sitting here editing this video and I just couldn't in good faith complete this video without mentioning another honorable mention, because the more I thought about it, I was like, wow, that really deserves to be on this list. And so my third honorable mention that absolutely deserves to be on here is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. This is by far the best classic that I read this year, but also it just totally took me by surprise. Little Women is the story of the March family. There's 4 sisters. It's very slice of life. The main character is the sister named Jo. She's very tomboyish. She doesn't really fit in with other women at this time. She is a writer, and it's just about her journey and her trying to kind of carve a life for herself in this Civil War era when women don't really have a lot of choices for what their life is going to look like. Her relationship with her sisters is very sweet. Her relationship with her neighbor, Teddy, is also very sweet. They kind of adopt him as like their brother. And I wasn't 100% happy with how this book turned out romantically for Jo, but I haven't stopped thinking about this book, and I read it back in March this year, and I never expected to like this book, much less love it. I never expected to be emotionally impacted by this book, but I absolutely sobbed while reading it. And yeah, I just think I should have read this book when I was younger, because I think it would have had even more of an impact on me then than it did now. Absolutely am inspired by Louisa May Alcott and the life that she lived, and I think that this book has absolutely stood the test of time and is a delightful read. So, got that off my chest. Okay, we can move on with the real video now. Getting into my actual top 10 list, and again, like I said, I still am uncertain about the order of these books, but when I get to my top 3, those are pretty solid, but the rest of these could shift around depending on my mood. But number 10 for today is going to be Annie Bot by Sierra Greer. I actually just read this for the Goodreads Choice Awards vlog, and I had been hearing things about this book throughout the year, and I was really impressed with this book. It is a literary sci-fi about a sex bot, and it is from the sex bot's perspective. Her name is Annie. She is owned by a man named Doug, and really this story is about emotionally abusive relationships and autonomy, what it means to be human, women's rights. It just has all of these deeper themes. It is absolutely infuriating and heart-wrenching to read, and Annie is such a likable character as she learns more and more throughout the book so that she can better serve her owner. She also starts to question her place, her agency, her own desires that are outside of Doug's, and what that means for her freedom, for her ability to live her own life. It's an incredibly hard read, but it was so beautiful, and I just adored this book, and I read it in essentially one sitting. I felt very emotional at the end. I think this could have ended on a really bleak note, but the author chose to take it in a slightly more hopeful direction, and I think that really sealed the deal for me. Number 9 is going to be The Oleander Sword by Tasha Suri. This is book 2 of the Burning Kingdoms trilogy, which starts with the Jasmine Throne and ends with the Lotus Empire. I read both Oleander Sword and the Lotus Empire this year, which was a new release. And the Oleander Sword book 2 was my favorite of the series and one of the most angsty reads that I had this year. This is an Indian-inspired fantasy series about various countries and the politics between them. One of the main characters lives in a conquered land, and she is a part of an oppressed class of people. Another main character is the sister of the emperor, and she was supposed to sacrifice herself for a religious ceremony and chose not to, so her brother threw her in prison. And the third main character is the wife of a governor in this oppressed land, and she was also one of the subjugated classes of people but has risen in status since then. It is intricate and complex, and in the midst of these political machinations and wars that are happening, there's also the old gods are returning to the land. The old gods are creatures called the Yaksa, which are very sort of Ent-like, but way creepier. And there's a disease spreading around the land that they call the rot, where plants are growing underneath the skins of people and slowly sapping them of life. It just has so much cool world building, and the characters are fantastic. But the thing that really elevated the second book for me was the sacrifices that these characters had to make to give up the things that they wanted to do the things that they needed. And it was absolutely heart-wrenching to see them make these decisions and follow through on them. And the whole time I just wanted to like scream at the pages and be like, no, don't do it. And they did it anyway. And it just was so epic and cool and sad and beautiful. And I just felt for these characters so much. So the Oleander Sword definitely had to make the list. Number 8 is going to be The Girl in the Tower, which is another book 2. Book 1 of this series is The Bear and the Nightingale, and book 3 is The Winter of the Witch. I actually just read this book like a couple days before I'm filming this, so there definitely could be some recency bias happening. But this trilogy is called the Winter Night Trilogy by Catherine Arden, and it is about a young girl accused of being a witch in kind of Russian medieval times, and it is heavily based in Russian folklore. There's all these cool Russian folklore creatures that this main character, this woman, can see that no one else can see, and it just has so much great wintry vibes. I know that sounds silly to say, but it was like a very atmospheric read, the entire series. And I thought that the second book had all of the charm and the beauty and the enchantment of the first book, but even better pacing and more high adventure. And I was actually very surprised the direction that the book went, and I thought it was fantastic. It really dives into the back and forth between the Christian religion that has become dominant and the kind of pagan, more folklore-ish beliefs that the people still hold, and how those are changing the dynamics of the magic and its ability to influence the world. So I just absolutely love those themes. The main character, Vazia, is super likable, and I related to her a lot. Also, she has an amazing magical horse called Solove, best animal companion of the year. Coming in at number 7 is going to be Margot's Got Money Troubles by Rufi Thorpe. And if you are surprised to see this on the list, no one is more surprised than me. I picked this up because, one, I thought the cover was intriguing, cover title combo, and 2, because I have a friend from high school that I follow on Goodreads, and she read it and posted a really intriguing review about it. And I was like, that sounds good, and I devoured it in a day. This is a contemporary novel about Margot, who is our 19-year-old protagonist. She is going to community college and she gets knocked up by one of her professors. And against everyone's advice, she decides to keep the baby and is trying to figure out how to navigate the world as a single mom and support her child. And she ends up doing this by starting an OnlyFans account. And it sounds like it could be really raunchy, but it is actually, it's done so well. And it really is more about Margot's decisions, how people judge her for those decisions, including her parents and her best friends, and the new friends that she tries to make along the way, the people who support her and don't, and how people judge women, how people judge young women, and especially young mothers, and how there's really no right choices that you can make in a situation like that. And the way that she actually interacts with her fans on OnlyFans is actually very sweet and endearing. And I just absolutely ate this up. I thought it had so many great things to say about women's ability to make choices in society, and I just thought that Margot was a really great character. The tone throughout the book just really nailed it. And Margot actually is telling the story, but she sometimes tells it in third person or sometimes in first person, depending on if she feels the need to kind of remove herself from the situation so that she can judge her emotional response more accurately. And I just thought that was a super interesting way to approach this. And I just thought all of it was super well done. At number 6, we have Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. This is a sci-fi classic, a dystopian classic, I should say. And it really just shook me. I haven't stopped thinking about this book, and I read it all the way back in February. It was gut-wrenching. It was so real. And I think part of the reason that it felt so real was because this book is actually set in 2024 and the author wrote it back in the 1990s. And so that just had a little bit of an extra dystopian twist. But basically, this is based in our society and just a little bit removed. But society has basically collapsed, and the main character is living in kind of a walled subdivision to keep out the roving hordes of homeless people, and that is most of the population at this point. There's so many feral dogs, it's really not safe to leave their compound, but eventually their compound gets broken into and she has to go out on the road and try and survive. But that's really only half of what the book is about. Parable of the Sower is this main character. I think she's only like 15 years old when the main action of this book takes place, and she has kind of rejected her father's religion. Her father's a Christian pastor, and that's not what she believes, and she has started to create her own belief system, which she calls Earthseed. And as she's traveling on the road, she is preaching this to other travelers that she meets and gathering somewhat of a congregation who believe her. And so it's sort of the story of a rise of a cult leader and this community that they try to create in this like post-apocalyptic landscape. It's crazy. And at the same time it's horrific and it's violent. And I remember so vividly this one scene where they're like camped somewhere that doesn't feel safe, and they hear a dog and it comes like around the bend and it has like a toddler's arm in its mouth, and I just like, that image is seared into my brain still. It's an absolute gut punch of a book, and Octavia Butler's writing is so sparse in a way that just leaves so much on the page. It just feels raw, and that's the only real way I know how to describe it. But Parable of the Sower absolutely deserves the spot on this list. Into the top 5 now, and number 5 is actually going to be Sing Like Fish by Amarina Kingdon. This is the only nonfiction on my list this year, and wow, what a book. Sing Like Fish, the subtitle is How Sound Rules Life Underwater, and it is about the science of underwater acoustics and how underwater sound affects wildlife and ecosystems underwater, and how human activities like boating and shipping and drilling affect the ability for wildlife to hear and to make sounds and to communicate and reproduce and all of these different things. It talks about the science of how sound travels underwater. It talks to actual scientists who are studying underwater acoustics and their impacts on wildlife. And it does, I think, the best kind of nature writing where we are talking to scientists, we're adventuring with scientists, we are learning things, and just, I felt like a whole world opened up to me when I was reading this book. I was totally immersed in it. I was fascinated. I haven't stopped thinking about the things that I learned, and I will be bookmarking this author if they come out with any more books like this in the future. Also, I just thought the cover of this book was absolutely gorgeous. I feel like nonfiction books often have really boring covers, and this one just reminded me of like an Audubon drawing or like a scientific poster, and all the little like dots that it has to like indicate sound waves. Just so clever and well done. I love it. Coming in at number 4, we have a seemingly controversial pick this year, but that is going to be The Mercy of Gods by James S.A. Corey. If you know me, this won't be a surprise because I am a huge fan of The Expanse. I'm actually rewatching the show right now with my husband, and I've read the entire book series. I have several videos on this channel about The Expanse. It is one of my favorite sci-fi series of all time. So it's not surprising that James S.A. Corey's new book is on my top 10 list this year. But it seems to be an unpopular opinion. I don't think other people are loving this book as much as I am, and that's sad. But The Mercy of Gods is the start of a brand new sci-fi series. I believe it's going to be a trilogy. It is about a alien invasion, basically. It starts off in the first few chapters, we're following this group of scientists. They've been working together as a team, researching this topic together, and there are rumors that their team is about to be broken up and positioned in different laboratories, and the team doesn't want this to happen. They want to continue working together, and they think the reason they've been so successful is because they work well as a team. So there's some sort of like political intrigue, but on an academic scale, as they're trying to suss out who's trying to break them up and why, and like what levers they can pull to keep themselves together. And then very quickly, their planet is invaded by an alien species and dominates the humans on the planet, like instantly. They're so outmatched, it's not even a contest. These scientists are taken captive and taken away to an alien world. And the story, of course, goes in a completely different direction after that. And it was just absolutely fascinating to me. The aliens in this story felt very alien. They felt very otherworldly, which I feel like a lot of times when you experience aliens in a sci-fi setting, they just feel like kind of humans, but with extra arms or tentacles or whatever, and they don't feel actually all that different from us. So I love when an author is able to pull that off really well, and these felt so out there. And it wasn't just one alien species that we were dealing with, it was lots of different alien species, and they all felt very distinct and unique. The world that the scientists were taken to was very interesting as well, and what they were forced to do. I just loved the human psychological dynamics that were at play in the story, of what it felt like to be subjugated, especially, humans have become adjusted to being the dominant species for a very long time, and so kind of what that did to these individual people and their team, and how they all coped with it in very different ways, often unhealthy ways, I found to be a very interesting psychological study. There was also a separate alien species outside of the ones that were the conquerors that called itself the Swarm. And I really loved the kind of swarm subplot that was happening throughout the story. And I honestly have no idea where this is going to go in the next couple of books, and I'm fascinated to find out, but there is betrayal afoot, and I can't wait for the angst. Coming in at number 3 this year is going to be The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi by Shannon Chakraborty. I actually just got this book for Christmas, and I'm so excited to have it on my shelves now. Amina Al-Sarafi is a retired pirate, and she has started a family. She's moved on. She's done well for herself. But a family member of one of her former crewmates comes to her and says that her granddaughter has been kidnapped, which was the daughter of one of her crewmates, and that she needs Amina to rescue her. And Amina feels obligated to take up this quest because she feels guilty about this crew member who was the kidnappee's father, I guess. She feels guilty about how he died and feels like it was her fault. So she feels the need to come out of retirement and go on this one last adventure to help. So she basically has a very kind of heist plot at the beginning where it's like, get the crew back together, and then they have to figure out a way to track down and save this girl. Hijinks ensue. There are such great characters in this story. The adventure is so much fun. And the plot threads that were left behind for where the next book in the series are going to go are absolutely intriguing, and I cannot wait for the next book to come out in this series. Shannon Chakraborty is just magic to me. She is an auto-buy author. The Daevabad trilogy right here on my shelves was my absolute favorite fantasy series that I read last year, and I would read her grocery list. Like, Shannon Chakraborty, give me more. Give me more, I want it. Coming in at number 2 this year is The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie. This is book number 5 of the First Law World series, but it is the second standalone book in between the two major trilogies of this series. The Heroes is a book that takes place over 3 days, and those 3 days are a single battle. The perspectives are characters from all over the field of battle. You have generals and soldiers and messengers and daughters of captains and people who are just on the periphery of this battle and people who are in the midst of it. And I just never imagined that you could read a battle for an entire 500-page book and it'd be so interesting the entire time. This book never flagged. It was so fascinating from start to finish, and the horror that these people were experiencing and the political machinations that were happening on the outskirts and how that influenced the way that the battle was playing out. It was so masterfully done. I have never read a book like this, and I don't think anyone except Joe Abercrombie could have pulled it off. It was absolutely masterfully done. It is, of course, grimdark. The characters are not necessarily likable, but the message that it had overall of just the pointlessness of war and how when the book ends that these factions are basically in the same place that they were before the battle began, but there's been all of this loss of life in the meantime. It just hits. It hits so hard. I read this book in January of 2024 and I have not stopped thinking about it. It has been my absolute favorite book for most of the year, and I was really surprised. I was going to be really surprised if any book usurped it, but one did. So moving on to book number 1 of 2024, the absolute pinnacle of not just 2024, but my reading experience of the last many years. I wish for this experience every single time I pick up a book, and that is The Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. You may have seen this one coming if you noticed the gap on my shelf up here. But yes, I read the entire Stormlight Archive this year, which is 5 books. The 5th and final book, Wind and Truth, actually just came out in December, and I have already read it. I read all of them, and I loved the entire series. The Way of Kings, the first book, absolutely blew me away. This is actually the 2nd book out of 5, and if I was not going to limit the number of books by one author that could be on this list, then probably my top 4 books of the year would all be from the Stormlight Archive. So that's why I did put a cap on it. But The Words of Radiance, book 2 in this series, was to me the absolute pinnacle of not just this series, but what a fantasy book can be. It had incredible world building. It had incredible plot. It had incredible characters. It was the trifecta. There was so many good emotional dynamics. There were so many good character moments. The characters and the plot that were set up in book 1 really took off in this book. And I just felt so deeply for these characters. I was so enraptured by the struggles they were having. The action was actioning. There were great reveals. This book is almost 1,100 pages long, and it did not feel like that at all. I could say that I think of most of the Stormlight Archive books, where it just flies by. Like, you never feel the weight of the book when you're reading it, because it is just so well done. It's so well paced. It is magnificent. I think this is a pinnacle. I think I've already said this. It's a pinnacle of what I think fantasy books could be like. I feel absolutely transported to a different time and place when I am reading these books, and I feel like all of these characters are real. This Roshar, the world, is real and actually exists out there, and if I just knew how to get there, I could go visit it. And I do feel like I am visiting it when I read these books. I love it so much. Words of Radiance. This book in the series stands out to me because of 3 things in particular. One is the character moments that Kaladin and Shallan share when they are in the chasms. One is a surprising moment from Adeline at the very end of the book, which I am not going to talk about. And another one is betrayal by a member of Bridge 4. So if you've read these books, you know exactly what all of those things mean, but those in particular made this book really stand out and be surprising and interesting in ways that just make it a head and shoulders even above the rest of the Stormlight Archive books. So I could probably talk about this all day, but it would be super spoilery, and we're not going there in this video. So those are my top 10 books of 2024. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books. I would love to know if you agree or disagree with me, or if they made it onto any of your favorites list. If you and I don't have any overlaps, just let me know what your top 10 favorite books of the year were, or if you don't have a top 10, just one or two of your favorites would be great. I'd love to hear what they are and add them to my TBR if I haven't read them yet. Thanks so much for tuning in and hanging out. Be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button down below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you next time.